Peace, family. Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to Sankofa Video, Books, and Cafe. I'm Jordan Cato Strudwick, and I am grateful to be here. I'm grateful that we're here together this evening, and I'm especially grateful for the profound education that we are about to receive. Now, we are gathered here today for a discussion on post-colonial Kenya, the second event in our three-part Politics of Kenya series. 2 weeks ago, in part one, we discussed colonial Kenya, learning about the period of Kenyan history after the onset of British colonialism up to the resistance movements that toppled the European-dominated caste-based settler colonial system. Today, for part two, post-colonial Kenya, we will be discussing Kenya in the early days of independence with some brilliant Kenyans who will be introduced to you shortly. 2 weeks from now, on August 31st, we will hold our final gathering in the Politics of Kenya series, a discussion on contemporary Kenya. The reason that Haile came to see this broader discussion as necessary is the continual contemporary involvement of Kenya under the William Ruto administration as an imperialist weapon both on the African continent and in the Caribbean, as well as the repression and oppression of the Kenyan people at home, which have been brought to the attention of the world again recently by the second round of major Gen Z protests against William Ruto's government. Our goal is to develop a thorough understanding of the progress of Kenyan politics to this point in order to truly understand the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. And this second discussion will build on the foundation laid by the first as we continue to develop the necessary contextual grounding for our understanding of the modern Kenyan situation. Our guests will explore Kenya's post-colonial history, examining the nation's journey after independence and the challenges that shaped its modern identity. Before we begin in earnest, I would also like to note that this series is not the extent of the Kenya-focused events that we intend to have over the coming weeks and months. We planned events centered around the work of our recently departed literary hero, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, screenings of films about Kenya, and more. We're extremely, extremely grateful for the presence and involvement of the contingent of young Kenyan firebrands who've been gracing us with their presence, their perspectives, and their leadership in these events. And we sincerely hope that they will continue to be involved with us here through these gatherings and beyond. Coming to the stage to introduce herself and our panelists is one of those firebrands. Please give a warm round of applause and welcome of our sister, Wanjiru Gitai. You may recognize Wanjiru from the Haiti on Our Mind event where our community was introduced to her, wherein she helped us wrap our minds around the Kenyan troop invasion of Haiti on behalf of U.S. interests. You may also recognize her from our first Politics of Kenya event 2 weeks ago, or you may recognize her from a recent viral video of her forceful critique of tribalistic politics in the national arena. Her critique, made towards a politician from within her own Kikuyu people, has made her villainous to some and heroic to many. I personally fall into the camp of those who find her heroic. Please give another round of applause for Wanjiru Gitai.
Thank you so much, Jordan. That was very heartwarming. Thank you to the Sankofa. Thank you, Haile, Jordan, Marie, to everyone, and everyone who's come, even with the rain, to attend this talk. You know, this is a beautiful space. And because of time, I'm not going to keep us waiting. I will introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Luca Amayo. He is a political strategist and campaign veteran who has led public affairs for candidates and causes at every level of government. He began his career with a K Street lobbying firm where he specialized on clean energy projects for some of the nation's leading energy companies, trade associations, and organizations. His campaign experience includes serving as spokesperson for Governor Wes Moore in his historic bid to become Maryland's first Black governor, for former Mayor Sheila Dixon, the first Black woman to lead a major American city, and for the Maryland Democratic Party in the coordinate campaign to elect Angela Alsobrook as the first Black woman to represent Maryland in the U.S. Senate alongside other frontline Maryland Democrats. The persistent gap between his ideals and the realities of mainstream democratic politics led him to found his own public affair firm designed to serve reform-minded candidates, insurgent campaigns, and high-stake policy fights. He graduated from Augustana University in South Dakota, where he was the first person of color to be elected to lead the student body. Welcome so much, Luca Amayo. Our second speaker is Chorey John. Chorey is a licensed attorney based in Washington, D.C., currently focusing on international law. He is originally from Kenya, and his passion for law and politics has seen him take an aim at political apathy with the goal of making many aware of their legal rights while enhancing their political aptitude. Let's welcome Chorey John. Again, karibuni sana. That means welcome.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It is a privilege to speak on behalf of our young organization and our generation in the very important dialogue we're having right now about who we are, how we got here, and where we can go next. I think that our generation has a unique opportunity that generations before us would have been keen to be a part of, and it's an opportunity that we should not let up on. It's important that we learn our history, especially a history that I think many of us would agree that we've been thoroughly miseducated on, especially if you grew up in Kenya and you had an 844 education. But the internet has been transformative. I mean, we have access to archives, we have access to declassified documents, we have access to a lot of primary sources that help us understand not just the sum of forces that was dedicated to destroying the movements that our forefathers created, but also how the empires that inflicted this on us thought of themselves and thought of us. And why they proceeded to act the way that they do. So that's a conversation that I wanted to lean in today, talking about the invention of the modern police state that we find ourselves in today in Kenya. But I will trespass a little bit on the pre-colonial period just to highlight some points of how we could argue that we ended up where we are today. Just a couple quick terms here that I will skip over. I think the nature of violence is very important in this conversation. In modern nationhood, the idea of the state has a monopoly on violence is core to how we understand nations today. And I think Kenyan history is a key example of how when there is any force that trespasses on that, where the people reclaim that right to themselves, not to be violent, but to protect themselves from violence by any means necessary, is one that these centralized powers react to with the full force of everything that they have at their disposal. And guerrilla warfare, like the kind that we discussed last time in the Mau Mau movement, that was not universal. That was not the experience of every African country or every country in the global south. Kenya was the first place that an African force organized a guerrilla warfare movement at the scale that it did. And I want to talk a little bit about not just the impact that that had on Kenya, but the impact that that had on both the British and the UK, the British and the American colonizers or neo-colonizers who have been on the other side of this violence. A couple more important terms here, I think, is an insurgency, which is, that campaign of armed struggle waged by grassroots forces, similar to what the Mau Mau was. But the term that's really going to be key to this presentation is counterinsurgency, because I think understanding counterinsurgency as it was conceived by the British in response to these conflicts, not just in Kenya, but in other parts of the British Empire where they're seeing this, is really the underpinning of the modern international security apparatus. And when we think of these modern alphabet institutions, FBI, CIA, NSA, MI6 in the UK, I don't think we've been educated enough on how deep the legacy of the freedom movements in Kenya are in the history of the developments of those security forces. And the dedication, the amount of effort, the amount of coordination that they dedicated to destroying our movements on the other side. This has been so formative for how modern security is thought about in modern states. And I think it's really important to understand how this pushed Kenya into what we understand it as today, as an outpost for imperialism, as a police state for the people who live within it, and the role that this history has played in doing that. And so we've handed out this table. I hope all of you have a copy. If you don't, please refer to someone close to you. This paints a larger picture. I wanted to zoom out on the impact the Kenyan situation really had on the British imperialist forces. And kind of what you're seeing is a timeline of how what we think of as counterinsurgency today was developed. By the time Britain was declaring Kenya and the East African Protectorate, it was already ascendant as an empire. It had defeated multiple other empires, it had risen to the top, and its dominance in military affairs was complete, at least in conventional warfare. So the notion that a ragtag army of guerrillas anywhere could bring a standstill to the great British Empire was something that could not have been conceived in that time. And they actually invested a significant amount of resources to obscuring overall. But what you're going to see in this presentation, I will touch slightly on Palestine and Malaysia before we get to Kenya, because what we want to convey is how the tactics that the British Empire utilized to respond to those insurgencies was not just defined in these countries, but the worst scale, the most brutal scale that we saw that playbook deployed happened in Kenya, in our country. Just to touch on it very broadly and why it's important, I think, especially as we look to the last row, what we describe as weaponized tribalism really underpins some of the struggles that we're dealing with today. Even among our own movement, there's a very live debate about the role that tribalism should play in our future. And there's this perception that it is internal, inherent to who we are as Kenyans. And I don't think enough time has been dedicated to understanding how this was actually a foreign imposition, how this period of colonialism and post-colonialism redefined how the Kenyan people interacted with each other. Because the deployment of these tactics happened with their first in Palestine, later in Malaysia, but Kenya was where we saw the full crucible of what it means to use violence to control an indigenous population and get them to subordinate to the will of foreign powers. So I want to talk a little bit about the origin of counterinsurgency. And the way I want to talk about it is in terms of, we could talk about this as interlocking systems, right? You have what colonialists are aiming to do is they're usually using their three tools of the three favorite tools. You know, colonialism is the political structure, capitalism is the economic structure, and if you wanted to add a third, you could talk about Christianity and the role it played as a social and a cultural tool for the deployment of that. But long before they were employing these tactics outside of the core of the empire, they were employing them at home in Britain, as they were trying to figure out how to rearrange power in a way that better accommodated the privileged classes. At this period of time, right before the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the idea was put forward that what used to be common land that belonged to everyone, any farmer could come in there and grow and make a living in subsistence. Those lands were cordoned off through what was called the Enclosure Act in the UK, that pushed people basically from subsistence, from providing to themselves, to what we could even call wage slavery, where they're dependent on the wages that are being given to them by the landowner. So they created a new class with these through this enclosure process, and it became one of the first tools that they would deploy again and again. And that's why you see land alienation as one of the tactics that's been listed there. But we wouldn't see the full force, the full spectrum of that being introduced in Kenya until the British imperialist forces had gone through a period of transformation. I want to touch on Palestine very quickly because I think it's an important part of this story and how our struggles really have always been interlinked. Because what you're dealing with in Palestine is one of the very first times the British, at the peak of still enjoying the peak of their power, are facing a revolt from the indigenous population. And they started to utilize some of the tactics that you're seeing laid out there. They were confronted with widespread rebellion as colonialism, as nationalisms, and the forces to repel colonialism were really taking root in the Arab world. This is when the first gust of independence is blowing through the global south, and what was at the time called the Palestinian Mandate was one of the first places where we see this, and the tactics that we see the playbook being deployed for the first time. Certain parts of what we've seen and what we'd see in the future, especially as we're talking about these tactics were deployed at length there. One of the first things you see is how they pull together military, police, and all what we'd consider security forces into one force and tell them, we want you to dedicate everything to destroying this movement. So even that amalgamation of security forces was not how the British imperial security architecture worked before that. Police, army, intelligence are all separate functions. But in Palestine, they learned for the first time that if we're going to beat these nationalist movements, we need to amalgamate these forces. We need to be, using them to not just learn what our opponents are doing, but to be able to preempt it. We need to break up the forces by limiting their access to each other, by limiting them in terms of their movement. We start to see these tactics being deployed at scale. The British responded at the time with what one scholar described as a raft of military, social, political, psychological, and economic punishments for people who identified with those movements, who supported those movements. And that's a preview of what you start to see in the future. Another one of the questions they start asking themselves is, how can we lift up a certain group of the locals, of the indigenous people, to be our hands and feet on the ground, that we will have a more successful movement if we can somehow co-opt some of the local populations and include them in the administration of these colonial states. So indirect rule is already a tool of favor at this time, but they really start to perfect it in Palestine. One of the other things I'll mention really quickly also is the psychological warfare. They dedicated a lot of time and a lot of resources to creating these squads that would go in and terrorize the local populations that supported these movements. And psychological warfare becomes one of the tools in their toolbox. But the most important one that we're talking about here is the weaponization of tribalism, where we have Arab loyalists versus Jewish loyalists. How can we scatter these movements? How can we elevate the divides between these people so that they can less effectively coordinate against us? They were successful in beating back the Arab nationalism that was developing in the area, and we kind of know what happens next in that story. The state of the Jewish people are elevated as the locals of choice. The Israeli state is sort of created on that basis, on the suppression of the local Arab populations and the elevation of the more favored group. Another quick example I will give here is what we call the Malaya emergency. Malaya is a peninsular region in Malaysia, in what is modern day Malaysia, where they really struggled to beat back communist guerrillas, guerrilla warriors in Malaysia. Most of them were ethnically Chinese. And so one of the tools they deployed there to undermine the Malaysian Communist Party was to say that movement is a Malay movement, is a Chinese movement. It's not a Malay movement. If the Malays want independence, then they shouldn't be associating with that. So they further split up these divisions so that they can scatter these nascent left-wing movements that are emerging. One other key thing that they started to develop in Malaysia is what we call hearts and minds campaigns. They realized you can't just do the stick. You can't just be beating back the local population. You have to give a carrot as well. And so that's where this hearts and minds idea comes from. How can we start giving the locals food? How can we start educating them? How can we give them healthcare to these favorite groups that we've selected so that they are less incentivized to be part of these left-wing movements? And so the success, especially of what they were able to do in Malaysia, ended up being what the British themselves understood as the playbook for when you are dealing with a counterinsurgency. They described this as the Malaya Doctrine, named based off of what they had been able to successfully do in beating back the Malayan Communist Party and elevating their favorite group instead. So a lot of the tactics that they ended up deploying in Kenya this ended up being the manual for how they were going to beat back a local insurgency. I'll skip over Northern Ireland, which is happens down the line, but one of the points I wanted to emphasize here is what Frantz Fanon described as an imperial boomerang. If you as an imperialist use these tactics out in the colonies, outside the core, out in the periphery, one phenomenon that's been observed time and time again is it's only a matter of time until you inevitably use those same tactics in suppressing your own population. They brought this home to England itself when the Irish were fighting their own war of independence from what they perceived also as a colonialist force. And by the time we get to Ireland, so much of what we're describing here has already been locked in as the manual. They had the scale of what they had to beat back in Kenya was greater than what they had been used to, what they had to do so far. But their perceived success in doing that not only pushed them deeper into this doctrine, but I think also in Ireland you start to see a good example of not just the manuals being distributed to wherever they had to fight these new battles, but also the staff, the personnel, the people who had been successful. You did this in Palestine, come do it in Kenya. You did this in Kenya, come do it in Oman. You did this in Oman, come do it back home in Ireland. We'll highlight a little bit of that as we move forward. But jumping back into Kenya, and I'm trespassing just a little bit on the independence movements because of where we see the seeds of the modern police state emerging here. We talked a little bit in brief last time about Koitalel Arap Samoei in 1905, who is one of the greatest heroes in Kenyan history. And had he been a white man who would truly be understood as one of the great military generals on par with Hannibal or any of these people that are celebrated in Western doctrine. What Samoei was able to do is, as they were building the railway into the interior of Africa, all the way to the coast, they started in Uganda, they were trying to make all their way in Kenya. They faced a resistance so fierce that they found themselves totally unprepared for what they had to deal with. And keep in mind that at this time, the English have defeated every major enemy that they have in conventional warfare. Whether it was the Dutch, the Portuguese, the people with these huge standing armies, they've defeated. So the notion that these guerrillas in some part of Africa was able to hold them off for almost a decade, was able to frustrate the development of this train, was able to defeat tens of thousands of British officers who are being deployed to beat back this movement, was a huge blow to the British psyche. And it was something that was very, that they knew they had to obscure. Ultimately, as you heard last time, they managed to defeat Koitalel by inviting him to a truce. They said, listen, we've been unable to beat you. How can we come to terms? Come sit down and let's talk. And when he arrived, they shot him and everybody who accompanied him point blank. In one of the greatest acts of cowardice that I think is unknown to the world, that they were unable to beat this general in asymmetric warfare, and they reverted back to covert tactics. And you could kind of point to this event as one of the first times. This is the man who assassinated him, one of the colonial officers, who wrote about it at length in his book. This is where they learned that sometimes, if we can't beat them in asymmetric warfare, we have to use surreptitious tactics. How can we defeat them? How can we do sneaky things? How can we cut it down before it gets to this point where we have to meet them in asymmetric warfare? Obviously, by the time we get to the expanse of the East African Protectorate, these tactics are fully fledged. They are dealing with. They've managed to scatter multiple oppositions. Koitalel was assassinated. Mekatilili Wamenza was exiled. A number of armed resistance movements against the British had been successfully scattered. They realized, though, that they wanted to employ what we just discussed as the Malaya doctrine, and they figure out that, hey, how can we find a class of Africans who can administer this colony on our behalf? And the way we do that is we're just going to do what we did with the British enclosure. We do what they call the Crown Ordinance laws in Kenya, where they captured all the common land that people used to freely use before for their own subsistence, and now you had to buy it. But the only people who could buy it, of course, were their chosen leaders, were the African leaders who are collaborating with the British against their own people. We see at this point they've become masters at manipulating the factions within the people who are fighting each other. If there's any sort of contention between these two groups of people, how can we ratchet it up? How can we make it violent? How can we give one side the weapons to totalize the other group? And soon, eventually, you're seeing a variation of what we call the gun slave trade cycle when we're talking about slavery, but we're dealing with a colonial version of that, where you either side with the British or you lose. You either side with the British or you die. So there's some groups of people who are saying, that sounds like a good deal to me. I've been trying to beat this guy for so long. If there's someone who's going to help me do that, sign me up. There were Africans who signed up for that role. And they did it in significant measures. We don't have time to go into all of them. We could talk about the iterations of what that looked like. We could talk about the King's African Rifles. We could talk about the tribal chief system themselves. But I think the most important thing to understand here is they supplanted the existing government structures of the African peoples. They appointed chiefs where there had been no chiefs. It might be a council of elders. But if you want to be in charge of this group of people that you belong to, you want to be a chief, work with the British, they're going to make it happen for you. Ultimately, one of the big points that led to the inflammations that we see in the Mau Mau movement is the imposition of taxes. The hut taxes that they were imposing on the African people. They said, hey, you have to pay for each hut you own, you have to pay for each head of cattle you own. And I think one point I would make here is when you look at a lot of these revolutionary movements, there's one of the major catalysts typically is economic pressure. Even America was started on the back of a tax revolution. Taxation without representation. Most people when you undermine their ability, their livelihood, their ability to provide for their families, their ability to take care of themselves, that might be the last straw. They may be willing to encounter any sort of humiliation, any sort of violence, any sort of anywhere they can negotiate pragmatism, they may be willing to do it. But once you start to take away their means to provide, to protect, that's usually the last straw in a lot of these movements. And that's a commonality that you can see across all of these. And that was one of course, the key inciting moments in the development of the Mau Mau, what subsequently became the Mau Mau rebellion. One more quick key point here is who was enforcing these taxes? Who was enforcing the hut tax and the head tax for the cattle tax? It was Africans who were enforcing it against other Africans. And this is a tool. The British inherited indirect rule from their ancestors. They looked to the Romans, who employed similar methods when they were collecting taxes from oppressed populations. I'm sure we're all familiar with the tax collectors in the Bible. And you kind of get, if you've been raised in the religion, you kind of get the sense that the writers look at this group as a group of traitors and turncoats. And that's why Jesus saying, like, I will associate myself with the tax collectors is such a faux pas. Like, everyone was like, why would he do that? It is because the role of these collaborators is one that the society they belong to typically detests. But they were key to enforcing it. And the British really perfected this system of indirect rule with a level of organizational acumen that had not been seen before. Creating the native affairs departments that would sort of administer the appointments of the chiefs and so on. Or the special branch, again, is that tactic of bringing together police, military, political functions into one institution. In Kenya, that was called the special branch. And it's a tactic they deployed in other parts of the empire. But this is where we start to see the emergence of the class of Africans that are willing to serve as enforcers for colonial rule. Of course, the Mau Mau was a violent resistance against that encroachment of people's rights, that surrender of sovereignty, and they were notorious for killing their own fellow Africans who are participating. When we think of the Mau Mau rebellion, we think of it as a war against the British, and it is. But when you look at the documentation of the losses, we're talking about dozens and dozens of British settlers that are dying, which, granted, is a shock to the consciousness of the imperialists. But we're still talking about dozens. The people who are dying in hundreds and in thousands in this period of emergency is Africans. Africans fighting against the Home Guard. Africans looking to oppress their people on behalf of the British. It is these forces that were meeting each other in that act of, in that period of warfare. But you start to see the elevation of these, the elevation of the local chiefs ends up becoming much more important because to undercut the Mau Mau movement, they really had to be innovative. And it went beyond the chief system. Here we have one of the famous chiefs, Chief Weruhi, who was notorious for the level of violence that he was willing to impose on fellow Kenyans. And we'll get into a little bit more into an example of that in a second. But one more point I want to add here is the development, as you'll see in the chart, of a tactic of what they called pseudo gangs. And if you take away nothing else from this presentation, this is a key part that I want you to take away. In Palestine, they started to develop this tactic of how can we get some people who are part of the movement to betray the movement? How can we arrest people? If we arrest people who are part of this movement, we hold them in custody, we torture them, we force them to defile sacred objects. It's everything from physical violence, spiritual violence, economic violence. How can we break you down enough that you're willing to betray your own people? And they would send them back They would send them back into these movements. They would rejoin these movements as their colleagues who've returned. You're saying, hey, this is the guy I've been fighting alongside for so long. This is my brother, my neighbor, my partner, not knowing at the time that he has been turned over, like he has betrayed the movement. He's become one of the, what they would come to call pseudo gangs, which is just traders who had been sent back into those movements. They developed, and I'll show you a quote in a minute, they developed that tactic in Palestine, but they perfected it in Kenya, and it was key. They credit it themselves as being a key to defeating the Mau Mau movement. Forced detention, forced villagization, a lot of sexual violence, physical violence. These were all the hallmarks of this, the level of brutality that they were forced to deploy to be able to beat back this movement. So that's why if you look again at that table, by the time they did it in Malaysia, 400,000 people, 500,000 people detained. That was the greatest act of mass detention people had ever seen up until that point, that an empire could do this. In Kenya, they tripled that number. At the peak of the state of emergency, it was almost 1.5 million people, by some estimates, that were held in mass detention. To consider the sum of force that it requires to be able to do that to a people, that's when you understand what our forefathers survived. You know, my grandfather was one person who was walking just in the middle of this state of emergency, and he ended up being detained for 3 days. The family did not know where he was because he was under detention just because he was walking on the street in his own country. One of the points that I do want to make here is the continuity of this security apparatus that they were using to deploy this. And one of the characters you see here, I think, is an important character, Sir Richard Cadling, who was a colonial officer, and he was one of his specialty was intelligence. The intelligence war, being able to collect intelligence. This was one of the first times an empire has had to deploy this outside of conventional warfare. We can't just go in and attack them. We need to know what are they doing, where are they moving, where are they going to attack. Despite the fact that Cadling had been a key figure in the anti-colonial, anti-independence movement, Jomo Kenyatta invited him to stay on as police commissioner after Jomo Kenyatta took power. The very first police commissioner that my country had was a colonialist who had cut his teeth in killing our heroes, in killing our freedom fighters. Another example I'll give here is Ian Henderson, who worked under Richard Cadling. Richard was successful in when we talk about perfecting the pseudo gang technique. This was one of the men who was behind it. He's the one who developed that tactic and perfected it. And he went on, speaking of the continuity with how they moved from different parts of the empire. After he did this in Kenya, his next appointment was in Bahrain, where they stayed in power up into the early 70s as colonialists. And that's where he received that title, the Butcher of Bahrain. This is a man who was trained, who considers Kenya where his techniques were developed and perfected. Ian Henderson was also because he developed this pseudo gang technique. I mentioned earlier that it was key to defeating the Mau Mau. Henderson was the man who was officially considered the killer of Dedan Kimathi. They were able to capture this another military genius who had held off the British Empire, a founding father to many Kenyans. His defeat was at the hands of this man Henderson, who went on to be the Butcher of Bahrain. He wrote this book about it at the time where you can see Cadling writing the foreword, basically speaking about the work that Henderson had done. But remember that one of Henderson's first postings, again, was in Palestine. That's one of the points that we need to take away here. You can see he says the pseudo-gang technique was not evolved in Kenya. It was used many years earlier in Palestine, both during the rebellions in that country and subsequently in the Malaya against the Chinese communist territories. And then he says, but it achieved its widest measure of success in Kenya. One final example I want to put forward to show you the continuity of these forces is a man named Sam Githu. Just to show you what the co-opted Africans and what the role they played in this movement. They would usually deploy Kenyans to watch other Kenyans on these plantations, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things you see over and over again in these declassified documents is the Kenyans who are willing to use the greatest amount of force and violence against other Kenyans were elevated and celebrated. Sam Githu was actually successful in one of the plantations. One of the earliest citations you see of him in the documents is a case where in the British Imperial Corps, they were fighting allegations of how badly they were treating the Kenyans on the ground. Sam Githu had dug a hole, left people there, threatened to bury them alive, beat people within inches of their life. All of this is documented. And because of the pushback, they felt pressure to show that he was going to receive some level of punishment. He served 2 years in prison for beating a number of people within an inch of their life. Worse yet, he was given a medal by the Queen of England for the role he had played in the Kenyan during the state of emergency. And it's people like Sam Githu and others like him, who are elevated into chiefdoms, who became the chiefs that even in the lead up to independence, who had been on the other side of the Mau Mau, these people end up becoming part of the apparatus of the state. Sam Githu is one of here you can see where he receives the Queen's commendation for his brave conduct. And here you can see where he's been awarded a medal by the Queen for his role in beating back and killing Mau Mau. Just to show you the continuity that these are the very same people who are in charge of the state, we want fast forward to this article 15 years ago, where Sam Githu is now well understood to be part of the first president, Jomo Kenyatta's inner circle. What's happening in this article is declassified documents 15 years ago make clear that he was one of the key figures that was being elevated in opposition to the Mau Mau. In fact, when they still thought Kenyatta was a bad guy who was being held in detention, they wanted to legitimize the wave of terror that they unleashed to punish the locals for what they had done. But they needed the support of Kenyans to do it, to show it, demonstrate it as legitimate. Sam Githu is one of the first people to sign that letter, to say that Kenyatta should not be freed. Kenyatta should, the people who have participated in this should be punished. This is someone who still ends up being part of Kenyatta's own inner circle when Kenyatta takes power. And I just picked one example because of to me, what was an offensive contrast for the commendation he receives from the empire to the role he played in relation to his fellow Kenyans. Of course, they played a key role in breaking down those movements, but when they were successful in breaking down those movements, this apparatus, this security apparatus that the colonialists have been using to beat back these movements is absorbed into the state in the advent of nationhood. So I want to talk a little bit about how just before I jump back into Kenyatta, about how the role of the colonialists evolve, especially as we move into the post-independence era, and the British are now in a very different place than when they started their adventure in East Africa, to call it, for lack of a better word. They on the tail end of World War II, they're no longer the dominant military power in the world. America is on the rise; they're on the come down. But what they understood intuitively is that if we're going to maintain relevance in this American-led world order, we need to figure out how we can make ourselves very, very useful to the Americans. And it was not just the British who had to do that. The French did it, and a number of other Western countries did it. But one of the ways that they demonstrated their usefulness was by handing over this security apparatus to the Americans. They say, hey, if you want to lead the world, you need to understand how to beat down these local populations. You need to understand how you need to have deep networks of intelligence throughout these local operations. You need to have a close relationship with the African elite suppressing this population if you want to be successful. Learn from our mistakes. We're here for your benefit. Let's figure out how we can make that, how we can formalize our relationship. So what was a UK-US partnership in the early years of colonialism ended up evolving into what we call the Five Eyes Agreement, where the security forces of each of these Western nations end up collaborating and working together to share information. And the way they're standardized, the way they're, again, the spheres of control that each empire is supposed to be responsive to, they're feeding into this pipeline of information, is their old colonial empires. Francophone Africa, if they need to know what's going on in Francophone Africa, they go to the French, who still have those networks. If they want to get into East Africa or West Africa, they talk to the British. This formal security agreement ends up being the underpinning of how modern security apparatus works. And many of the tactics that are now being taught in manuals, that are now being taught by information officers who've had experience. It's these colonial officers who've been successful in this who end up advising them on Cold War strategy, who end up advising them on how they can beat back the Russians. So that architecture doesn't disappear. It's just subsumed by the new big dog in town, and that's America. So as America is ascendant now as a colonial power, that's where you start to see the key role that these financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are playing to make sure that money keeps flowing. Because that's a compact they've had with the Africans. You give us the means to extract wealth from them, we'll give you the means to kill them and protect your power. And so these understandings are formalized through policies. Like one of the first times we're seeing the World Bank intervening in a heavy way in Kenya is with the Swinnerton Plan, entrenching that African elite by giving them, as settlers, it's becoming clear to the settlers, this colonial arrangement is not gonna hold, we might need to go back. The settlers who didn't wanna leave are saying, hey, I don't wanna let go of all this property. Who's gonna buy it? Like, I need to be compensated. Similar to what you've seen in Haiti and all these other places. How can we be compensated for letting go of these colonial assets that we have? So the World Bank puts forward a loan for the Kenyatta administration to buy back these plots of land. And the Kenyatta administration is more than happy to buy back that land and distribute it, not as it was promised to the people overall, but to distribute it among this African elite that have been developed. This was what was known as the Swinnerton Plan at the time. And it was the World Bank that underwrote the financing for the transfer of this land. But as the compact goes, if you give us the means to steal from them, if you give us the means to rob them, we will give you the means to kill them. And that's how, the Kenyatta administration was not hesitant about deploying those tools once it had it at its disposal, with those colonial officers still part of that compact. And you can see, and there's a long stretch, a long history of these left-wing leaders, not all left-wing, but a lot of left-wing leaders especially, having that architecture weaponized against them. You'll see Bildad Kagia on the far left, Pio Gamapinto. I wish we had more time to talk about these individual men and their contributions to the struggle. Both of those, Bildad Kagia, Pio Gamapinto, and Tom Mboya, all three leaders who were assassinated in the early period of Kenyan independence, with the support of the security apparatus now at Kenyatta's disposal. Other leaders like Makan Singh, one of the first men to organize a trade union in Kenya, a multiracial trade union, and went on further after that to organize an East African trade union on the basis of leftist principles, someone who should be celebrated in our history for his contribution. He definitely thought that while he was incarcerated alongside Jomo Kenyatta, that once we became a state, he would have a role to play. But the Kenyatta administration makes it very clear they're going to exile him. He dies in exile with no attention to the role he played in the colonial movements. Not taught at all. The more I learned about him and the work that he had done, you understand the degree to which we've been miseducated on the history and the roles that heroes like them had played. And of course, Oginga Odinga, father of our current opposition leader, Raila Odinga, Oginga Odinga falls out with the Kenyatta administration for their opposition to redistribution of resources. Is forced into exile as well with the support of that very same security apparatus. So you see the extent to which that they're much more willing to employ it to marginalize leaders who are ready to offer something other than the liberal vision, neoliberal vision that is starting to sweep the country at this point. So Kenyatta's been successful at defeating these left-wing movements at the behest of these imperial forces. You're seeing the transition from the UK to the US in control. Now, while Jomo Kenyatta was president, he had replaced Oginga Odinga as vice president with another candidate, Daniel Moi, who becomes one of, not the first, but one of the first vice presidents in the country. There's generally a mistrust between the executive, typically between the president and the vice president. The relationship between Kenyatta and Moi is not a good relationship, but he's ready to leave the administration at a certain point. He's saying, my power is being frustrated, my people are being maligned. I don't think I want to stay. At the time, one of the party leaders in KANU convinces him to stay in power, and months later, Kenyatta has died. So Gideon Moi inherits the power of this apparatus. He inherits the state, and he ends up being the ruler of Kenya for almost 25 years. But he is more committed than anybody to enforcing these imperial incentives. The architecture now is evolving into what was a special branch, evolves into what we call now the National Intelligence Service, NIS. You're seeing the development of other localized standing armies, like the GSU, the General Service Unit, which is essentially a crowd control unit to beat back these popular movements. Moi had no hesitation in deploying these tools. You see him here with a future president, Mwai Kibaki, and the party leader at the time who convinces him to stay in power. He rewards all these people who stay in close proximity to him. But there's trouble that is soon to unfold as he is asked to employ the IMF, which is now growing in confidence in its enforcement measures, is evolving now to move from what was once hut taxes and taxes on cattle is now what we'd call structuralized loan agreements. They say to your country, if you want money, there's a certain set of things that we're going to expect you to honor. And this is what is described in DC even today as a Washington consensus. And I'll go through this very quickly because I think it is important to understanding why these electeds worked the way they did. For you to be able to get the money, if you are a country in the global south, most of the revenue that is used to hold on to the state, that is used to meet the needs of the people, is not coming from taxes. It's primarily coming from government to government loans. The taxes are the collateral for the loan. They say, if you want this money, you need to be able to demonstrate your ability to meet these revenue targets. We just need to know we're going to make the money back. Even though they know that these states will probably not be likely to pay back these loans. But what do they ask for when they give you these loans? That's what's known as the Washington consensus. Number one, reduce the national budgets. Stop doing social spending, essentially. And what does that mean for the average Kenyan? It means less money for education, less money for healthcare, less money for any of the things that make life worth living for working people. They want you to shrink that expenditure so that you can create a profit out of the revenue at any cost, even if it means taking away anything that has the potential to give Kenyans a good life. Number two, that's essentially number two, move spending from politically popular areas towards neglected fields with high economic returns, things that create output, growth in GDP. That could be building infrastructure that goes nowhere. It's going to increase the GDP, but it might not have an effect on the lives of working people. That's the kind of project that they're looking for you to commit to. Reform the tax system. They have their spin on what this means, but essentially it means make sure you're getting as much taxes as you can from the local people. Reduce taxes for the people who are job creators. Reduce taxes for the people who own the means of production so that they can create jobs. You see that playbook by certain parties out here as well. Liberalizing the financial sector. That typically means privatization. That means allowing foreign capital to flow into your economy. It means allowing the global capitalists who now have inherited this system should have the power to invest wherever they want because they're looking for a return on their capital, regardless of what that means for the local populations. Exchange rates, similarly. Your exchange rate should not be in control. You should not be in control of your exchange rate in the way that a socialist country like China is. They say we want global capitalists to be able to set the terms of your exchange rate. And what they're typically pushing for is an exchange rate that, just to fast forward and skip over the economics, means less buying power for the working people, more buying power for the global capitalists. So they can come into your country, buy whatever they want at a cost that is favorable to them. But what does that do to the costs for working people? Can they afford to buy goods at whatever area they want? It means the opposite. It means they have less buying power. Reducing trade restrictions. They're saying most countries that are in development have an interest in protecting infant industries. We want to be able to substitute some of the things we're importing with our own ability to create that. The neoliberals say, no, that's not the way you should do it. We want these multinationals to be able to come into your country and produce those resources. That you have to privatize parastatals. You have to privatize state-owned companies. You have to privatize all the means of production. That means things that should be public goods. We're talking about water, electricity, housing. Those things should be privatized so that they can have control of them. Similarly with state-owned enterprises. Abolishing policies that restrict competition, similar to what I'm saying with trade. They want their advanced multinationals to be able to compete with your infant industries. And provide secure, affordable property rights is code for we want to make sure that if Americans invest in something, that you're not going to nationalize it. You're not going to take control of it for yourself, as you could see maybe Mossadegh tried to do in Iran, or et cetera, et cetera. Like nationalization for the good of the people is bad. Open access for the good of global capitalists is good. This is what we call the Washington consensus. And so every time they get a loan from the World Bank or the IMF, these are the impositions that the country is supposed to accede to. And we're going through this right now. We're going through a new period of privatization because of the new structural adjustment loans that the administration has been able to take on. What effect did those have in Kenya? Well, Moi had a real challenge. He had a real challenge because the reality of what that means for people is the affordability goes way down. And like I said at the beginning, when you trespass on people's economic ability to provide for themselves and in each other, that is when most people are pushed to the brink. And we saw the currency devaluations, the deregulation, all this stuff happening. The compact they're making with Moy, again, is we will continue to give you the security apparatus. You make sure the money keeps flowing. What did Moy do with that security apparatus? I think most Kenyans are well aware. This was a brutal dictator who was willing to do anything, to deploy violence at will, to deploy mass torture, to use those now same tools, pseudo gangs. You know, the National Intelligence Service it's really at its heyday underneath the Moy administration, because now it can deploy these same tools against the people to stop them from coordinating successful left-wing movements. And of course, in the 1980s, when these structural adjustment plans are first making their way to Kenya, that is at the same time. 1981 is when the IMF forced a currency devaluation. 1982 is when Moi declares Kenya a single-party state. He completely subordinates democracy. KANU is now the only party. Essentially, Kenya ceases to be a democracy for 25 years. And the timing is not a coincidence. He had the capacity to do it. He did not have an easy relationship with America, but as soon as he said yes to the structural adjustment plans, their capacity to, he's given even more capacity to suppress the state. You keep the money flowing, we'll give you the power to kill them if they dissent. And Moi was willing to use that. That went on through the 90s. You start to see some of these tactics also in terms of ethnic divisions. How can we exploit, especially using the security apparatus, using the NIS, is well established and well documented that thousands were killed and hundreds of thousands were displaced in tribal clashes that Moi and his administration were playing up to keep these movements scattered, to keep these movements divided. And by the time we get to the end of the 1980s, the middle to the end of the 1980s, the security equation in DC is changing. The Soviet Union has collapsed. They no longer feel they've met the match of the closest power that could challenge their supremacy on the global stage. So they feel a little bit more generous. We're like, okay, no, it's not purely about security. Maybe we should talk a little bit about human rights or about democracy. And that's when they start pressuring the Moi administration to open up for multi-party democracy again. If you listen to the political rulers, the political class in our country, they will tell you that the people who are still suffering today fought for multi-party democracy, and that's the reason why you have it. And I don't mean to downplay the role that they played. They did play a role. But of course, the youth movements played a huge role, but the biggest differentiating factor is when, in my opinion, I would argue, is when the American government finally comes down and says, if you do not open up for multi-party, we are going to cut off aid. And they pull back a $315 million loan that the country is now dependent on because of these structural adjustments. We are going to pull that back. As soon as the news had broken that the US was going to pull back $315 million in aid, that's when these opposition leaders, as we know them today, said we need to organize demonstrations. The administration is weak. It no longer has the power to thwart these movements. And so they coordinated in response to that loan denial. And started to push for what we now know as the Saba Saba protests. When in 1991 the aid was pulled back. The aid was pulled back, and they were forced to open up for multi-party rule. That affinity, that desire to see democracy was short-lived. Once again. As the Soviet Union goes down, a new threat comes up for the American people. In the 1990s, we have those embassy bombings in Kenya. And now they're re-gearing their security apparatus to fight what they feel now is the number one threat for them, which is Arab terrorism, as they understand it. But what does that do for Kenyan movements and for African movements, for left-wing movements by and large? It's like, yeah, we do care about democracy, but we like talking about it more than we like pushing for it. Now we have real things that we need to deal with. We have real threats, and we need everybody to get back into formation, because as long as these leaders are willing to aid us in the fight against terrorism, they can do whatever they want into our local populations. Again, the compact is renewed, and after the 90s, you start to see the specter of violence, his willingness to deploy that violence, scale up again. And though we were in multi-party rule, we did not really see Moi come out of power for another decade, because on top of that, he was able to scatter the movements coordinating against him. And further yet, he's able to confound the opposition and win election. Yes, there was rigging, but he won votes significantly. And I think that's a parallel to where we are today. You might have a dedicated, concerted opposition, but if you cannot organize that opposition, either because there is real disunity or manufactured disunity, you will have a hard time defeating whoever the system has put in charge at the top. So Moi has renewed this compact, and he's able to keep scattering those the opposition for almost a decade. And even though there was moments where America had less tolerance for him at different points, as long as those security questions emerged once again, they renewed their compact with him and allowed him to remain for one more decade. And you can see him with the different administrations in Washington that he was able to remain in power through. So what you'll always see is, regardless of, and Bill Clinton was the one who spoke about democracy the most out of all these folks. But what you will see is whatever they say domestically does not match up with what the security apparatus continues to do. There you will continue to see continuity no matter what. And I just want to underscore this role, this idea that that global architecture continues to function even today. The tactics that they use, the tactics you see in that sheet, became the manual essentially for how what was counterinsurgency is now called counterterrorism. The same firms that were the same alphabet organizations that were fighting that fight against colonialism have evolved to the ones who are fighting the fight against indigenous peoples today, who are still looking for sovereignty and self-determination. One quick point in closing. Before I hand off to my highly accomplished and very capable brother here, the state's ability to inflict violence is a power that they are going to safeguard no matter the cost. And that is who our governments are responsive to. It doesn't matter what the domestic population feels. They care about the opinions of the people who are cashing the checks. As long as those loans continue to flow, regardless of what it means for the local population, they will continue to be allowed to do whatever they want, like for us to fight against those movements. But I will say this on a personal note. To me, my experience of being Kenyan has felt like we are on the losing end of a war. Physical violence is one part of it, but what I'm hoping to convey is economic violence, spiritual violence. These are the things that will remain. The physical violence may kill men in time of war, but the economic violence kills the most marginalized. It is women, it is children, you know. The specter of privatization, the way people feel about that, was something that my mom, who worked for Kenya Pipeline, one of the parastatals, that was something that occupied her mind in the last year of her life a lot. She's seeing taxes going up. She's seeing her ability to provide going down. And she's seeing her long-term prospects at one of the few places that a normal Kenyan can get a good job being decimated. I don't disagree with nonviolence, but I would be lying if I said what Malcolm X taught did not resonate with me. If you believe something is precious, you have to defend it. If you believe the life of Kenyans is valuable, we have to defend it. And I don't know what that means yet. I don't know what it means to challenge the power of the state. But we know we come from a rich legacy, a rich history of people who are willing to challenge that monopoly of violence that the state has. And they're the reason why we are here today. The future for us feels bleak sometimes, but I think our ability to take these lessons of history and recognize that bringing down Ruto is more than about bringing down one elected. It's about challenging a system that is ready to replace him and ready to elevate somebody else in his place the moment he steps down. There's a lot we can agree on, but where we disagree is what are the options that we take off the table. But what we can agree on, I think, is that we must challenge this as a system rather than as an individual. With that, I think I'll hand off to my brother. Sure.